My name is Lieutenant Colonel Reagan Holt, United States Army, 17 years of service. And on the night my mother called my sister, our family's crown jewel, at her own dining table, I was still wearing the compression sleeve on my left arm from a surgery I wasn't allowed to explain to anyone in that room. If you're watching this from a base, from a hospital waiting room, from a courthouse hallway you never thought you'd sit in, comment your city below, then hit like and subscribe, because what happened 3 hours after that dinner is the reason I stopped explaining myself to people who never once asked what I actually did for a living. That night sits at the center of 3 things I still hadn't told anyone. The first was a manila folder sealed with a Department of Defense classification stamp, sitting in a safety deposit box 2 miles from my mother's house, containing a service record that would have changed every conversation in that dining room if a single page of it had been read aloud. The second was a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered, 6 weeks before that dinner, in a hospital corridor in Landstuhl, Germany, when my husband Grant Marsh stood at the foot of my bed and told me he needed some space to think, then flew home to Virginia without me. The third was a truth about who I actually was and what I had actually done in 11 years of classified assignments. A truth that was about to detonate in my mother's living room in a way none of us were prepared for, delivered not by me, but by 12 federal agents in unmarked vehicles who pulled into her driveway at 9:47 p.m. My mother, Diane Holt, is 61 years old, a retired elementary school vice principal from Alexandria, Virginia, and she has spent every year of my adult life sorting her 2 daughters into 2 very different boxes. My younger sister, Vanessa, 29, married Preston Chase III 18 months ago, a managing director at a firm on 6th Avenue, with a co-op on the Upper East Side, and a place in Southampton that gets photographed for a regional lifestyle magazine every August. At that dinner, my mother held up her wine glass, looked at Vanessa, and said, in the exact tone she used to use when Vanessa brought home straight A's, and I brought home a track medal nobody framed, "This is our family's crown jewel. Preston built something real. He built a life you can see." Then she turned to me, and I want you to understand, I was sitting there in civilian clothes because I am not permitted, under the terms of my last 3 assignments, to wear my uniform or discuss my unit designation at a private residence. And my mother looked directly at the woman who had spent the last decade doing work she couldn't imagine, and said, "You're just a broke soldier, Reagan. Grant doesn't even own anything. What do you 2 actually have to show for it?" I didn't answer her. 17 years of training does something to you that civilians rarely understand. It isn't that you don't feel the insult, it's that you've been drilled, in rooms far colder than that dining room, to let information sit until the moment it's useful. I picked up my water glass. I let the silence stretch exactly as long as it needed to stretch. My sister-in-law, Preston's mother Cordelia Chase, filled that silence the way she filled every silence in that family, with a small, satisfied laugh and the comment she would repeat, almost word for word, 3 more times before this story was over. "Well, someone has to do the paperwork, dear. Somebody has to file the forms while the real work gets done by people like Preston." I remember the exact texture of the napkin in my lap, the exact weight of the fork against the porcelain, because those are the details you hold on to when you are trained to notice everything and say nothing. 3 hours later, at 9:47 p.m., 2 black SUVs and a sedan turned onto my mother's cul-de-sac in Alexandria. 12 agents, Department of Defense and FBI Joint Task Force, moved up that driveway in a formation I recognized before my mother had even reached the front window. My mother opened the door already furious, already certain this was some mistake meant for a neighbor, and a man in a dark suit held up credentials and said 5 words that changed the temperature of that house permanently. "Washington knows your identity." He wasn't talking to my mother, he was talking to me. To understand why 12 federal agents were standing in my mother's foyer at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you have to go back 11 years, to a version of me that existed before any of this family learned to underestimate me, because underestimating me is, and has always been, a fairly consistent family tradition, one my mother inherited from her own mother and handed down without ever once questioning it. I commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Medical Service Corps at 22. The same year, Vanessa started her sophomore year of college on our parents' dime, while I paid my own tuition through Rotte, because my mother said medical logistics was basically nursing administration and didn't merit the same investment as Vanessa's marketing degree. That comment, delivered at my own commissioning dinner, was the first time I understood exactly how my family would categorize my service for the rest of my life, as a lesser, quieter, more domestic version of what a real military career should look like. What my mother never learned, because I was never permitted to tell her, is that Medical Service Corps officers with the right clearances end up embedded with Special Operations Task Forces, coordinating trauma evacuation logistics, casualty forecasting, and classified medical intelligence for units whose names don't appear in any press release. By 26, I was running forward medical logistics for a joint Special Operations Task Force, rotating through 3 classified theaters, coordinating with foreign intelligence services on casualty concealment protocols so that battlefield losses couldn't be used to identify unit movements. By 30, I held a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance with additional special access program caveats that meant I couldn't tell my own mother what continent I was on for 11 months at a stretch. She thought I was stationed at Fort Sam Houston doing supply chain paperwork. I let her think that, because the alternative was explaining classification law to a woman who had already decided, years earlier, that my life was smaller than my sister's. I married Grant Marsh 9 years ago, when I was 29 and he was 31, a commercial real estate broker in Northern Virginia, whose income depended almost entirely on relationships with developers his own father had cultivated for 3 decades before him. Grant liked to describe himself, at dinner parties, as self-made, a phrase that always made me set my jaw in a specific way I'd trained myself to control, because I had watched his father make 3 phone calls that landed him his first 2 accounts, and I had watched Grant fold under pressure exactly twice in 9 years of marriage. Once when a deal collapsed and he blamed a junior associate publicly to save his own reputation, and once, far more permanently, in a hospital corridor in Landstuhl, Germany, 6 weeks before my mother's dinner. I was wounded on a classified logistics coordination mission I still cannot fully describe in this recording, struck by shrapnel from an IED targeting a convoy I was traveling with to assess a forward medical resupply route, an injury that shattered my left radius and ulna and required 3 surgeries across 2 military hospitals. Grant flew to Germany when the army notified him, and for 4 days he sat by my bed and told everyone in that ward that his wife did logistics coordination, a phrase so deliberately vague that a visiting general's aide once asked him, not unkindly, whether he actually knew what his own wife did for a living. Grant didn't know. He had never asked past the first sentence I was permitted to give him, because the truth is, Grant had built an entire identity around being the more successful, more visible half of our marriage, and my classified silence let him keep that fiction intact for 9 years without ever once being contradicted. On the 4th day, a full colonel came to my bedside to deliver a verbal debrief on the casualties from the convoy attack, a conversation Grant was asked to step out of the room for, and something in Grant broke that day, not out of grief, but out of something uglier. The sudden, visible realization that his wife's classified work put her in rooms he would never be allowed into, working alongside people who outranked and outclassified him in ways his real estate deals never would. He stood at the foot of my bed that evening, my arm in an external fixator, and said the words that opened Loop B of this story, the sentence I have replayed more times than I've replayed the sound of the explosion itself. "I need some space to think, Reagan. This isn't the life I signed up for." He flew home the next morning. I finished recovery alone, in a foreign hospital, coordinating my own medical evacuation paperwork from a bed I couldn't fully move in, while my husband was back in Virginia, as I would later learn from a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, opening a joint consultation with a divorce attorney named Marcus Vance. Marcus Vance built his practice on exactly one repeated performance: prepotent, theatrical certainty, delivered in a courtroom voice even during private mediation sessions, as though every room he entered was already a jury he needed to win over. I would come to know his specific cadence intimately over the following months. The pause before he said something designed to wound. The way he'd lean back in his chair, as if bored by his own cruelty. In our very first joint mediation session, 3 weeks after I returned stateside on medical leave, arm still in a cast, Marcus Vance looked directly at me and said the sentence that would return, inverted, in a courtroom 11 weeks later. Let's be honest about what we're dividing here. My client built a career. Mrs. Marsh filed paperwork for the army. There isn't exactly parity of contribution to litigate. Grant didn't correct him. Grant looked at his own hands. What Marcus Vance and Grant didn't know, what nobody in that mediation room knew, was that I had already received a call, 4 days earlier, from a woman named Major Elena Cortez, retired U.S. Army JAG Corps, now running a boutique family law practice in Arlington that specialized in exactly one kind of client: service members whose classified careers made standard divorce proceedings a minefield of information they legally could not disclose without a formal declassification review. Elena had served 22 years as a judge advocate, the last 6 inside the same special operations legal framework I operated under. And she was the only civilian attorney in the region who understood, without me explaining it twice, why my personnel file couldn't simply be handed to a family court the way Grant's tax returns could be handed to his. They're going to try to paint you as underemployed, Elena told me over coffee in a shop 3 blocks from her office, her voice flat and procedural in the way I recognized instantly from my own training. They're going to use your silence against you, because they don't understand it's not silence, Reagan, it's classification. We're going to need a formal declassification review before this goes anywhere near a courtroom, and that review is going to take time. I need you to trust the process, and I need you to say nothing in mediation that you can't fully back up in open court. The mechanism of the turn, the thing that would eventually crack this entire case open, started as a single sealed envelope Elena handed me across that coffee shop table. An application for expedited declassification review of specific portions of my personnel record relevant to ongoing civil litigation. A process that exists precisely because military spouses have weaponized classification silence against service members in divorce court for decades. This is the pace requirement, Elena said, tapping the envelope. 60 to 90 days for review, sometimes faster if a judge orders it under a protective order. In the meantime, they're going to say whatever they want about what you do for a living, and you are going to sit there and let them, because the alternative is a federal crime. I remember the exact weight of that envelope in my bag for the next 6 weeks. A physical object I carried into every family gathering, every dinner where my mother compared me unfavorably to my sister, every mediation session where Marcus Vance performed his contempt for an audience of exactly 3 people. I remember thinking, the way you think about a grenade with the pin still in, that the moment would come when I wouldn't need to say a single word in my own defense, because a piece of paper was going to do it for me. While Elena worked the legal channel, I lived what amounted to a second parallel case, one that had nothing to do with the courtroom and everything to do with the family I still technically belonged to. My mother-in-law, Cordelia Chase, Preston's mother, who had somehow appointed herself a kind of unofficial arbitrator of the entire extended family's social standing after Vanessa's wedding, took to inviting herself to what she called family check-ins, gatherings where she would sit across from me with the specific, practiced disdain of a woman who believed her son's marriage into money had elevated her own moral authority over everyone else at the table. Cordelia's fixed trait, repeated with almost mechanical consistency across every interaction I had with her that autumn, was a performance of moral superiority disguised as concern. At a Sunday brunch in October, 4 weeks before the hearing, she reached across the table, patted my uninjured hand, and said, "I just worry about you, Reagan. Grant tells us you were never really present in the marriage. All that secrecy. I do wonder what a person is hiding when they can't even tell their own husband what they do all day." I said nothing. I ate my eggs. I thought about the envelope in my bag. My mother's version of the same disdain came dressed differently. Less performed concern, more open comparison. At a second dinner in late October, this one ostensibly to celebrate Vanessa and Preston's anniversary, My mother spent the better part of an hour describing, in granular detail, the square footage of Preston's Southampton property, the name of the interior designer who'd redone their kitchen, the specific vintage of the wine Preston had selected, and then turned to me with the particular smile she reserved for these comparisons and said, "And what's new with you, Reagan?" Still doing the same desk job? I had been, 4 days earlier, in a secure facility, reviewing casualty forecasting models for a classified rotation, still active, in a theater I was not permitted to name. I said, "Still the same job, yes." My mother nodded, satisfied, as though she had confirmed something she'd always suspected. Vanessa herself occupied a strange middle position in all of this, not actively cruel, but performing a kind of oblivious arrogance that came from having never once had to defend her own choices to anyone. At that same anniversary dinner, she leaned over to me during dessert and said, entirely without malice, in the tone of someone repeating a fact she'd simply absorbed as true, "Mum says you and Grant are having problems because you're never around. Preston says relationships need presence. Reagan, maybe you should think about what you actually prioritize." I looked at my sister, 29 years old, who had never once asked me a single question about what my deployments actually involved, who had built an entire understanding of my marriage's failure on second-hand commentary from a mother who didn't know the first true fact about my career, and I said, quietly, "Maybe." That word cost me more than anything Marcus Vance said in mediation, because it came from someone who was supposed to know me better than a divorce attorney ever could. If you've ever sat in a room and let people build an entire story about your life out of what they assumed rather than what they asked, you already understand why I'm telling you this. Hit subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where the story stops being about what they said about me and starts being about what the paperwork proved. The financial thread of this case opened almost by accident. Priya Anand, the certified forensic accountant Elena had retained to review Grant's disclosed assets, called me on a Thursday in early November with a question that didn't sound urgent at first. "Reagan, I'm looking at a transfer I can't fully trace. $41,000, moved into an LLC, registered in Delaware, called Harborview Capital Partners. Does that name mean anything to you?" It didn't. Over the following 2 weeks of subpoenaed bank records, Priya found that Grant had quietly moved just over $210,000 of marital assets into a series of Delaware and Nevada shell entities over the 14 months preceding my Germany deployment, structured through a business associate of his father's, timed to specific dates when Grant knew, from my deployment schedule, that I would be unreachable. Priya cross-referenced the transfer dates against my official deployment orders and found something neither of us expected. Every single transfer occurred within 72 hours of my departure on a classified rotation. Dates Grant, in his own sworn deposition, claimed he couldn't recall. The cross-reference became, in Elena's words, a forensic timeline that testifies for you when you're not permitted to speak. The declassification review Elena had filed 11 weeks earlier came back 3 days before the scheduled hearing. A partial approval, permitting disclosure in a sealed courtroom setting, under judicial protective order, of specific unclassified summary language describing my role, rank, and select commendations, though not operational details, unit designations, or theater locations. Elena called me the night it arrived, her voice carrying an edge of something I rarely heard from her, genuine anticipation. "Reagan, I need you to understand what we have now. We have a sealed personnel summary confirming your rank, your combat zone service, a Purple Heart citation, and language from your commanding officer characterizing your role as, and I'm reading this directly, critical to the survival outcomes of multiple casualty events across 3 classified rotations. We also have a full forensic financial timeline showing your husband hid assets, specifically during windows when your service made you unable to object. Marcus Vance thinks he's walking into a hearing about a housewife with a filing job. He has no idea what's about to be read into the record." That same week, a second, smaller mechanism clicked into place. The reason 12 federal agents ended up in my mother's driveway on a Tuesday night that had nothing directly to do with the divorce hearing itself, but everything to do with what happened after Cordelia Chase, at another family gathering, asked Grant to bring proof of my supposed unreliability to share with the extended family, in an effort, as she put it, to help everyone understand why the marriage failed. Grant, increasingly desperate as the hearing approached, and increasingly aware from Marcus Vance's private warnings that the declassification review wasn't going his way, made the single worst decision of the entire case. He photographed a partial deployment order I had left, improperly for me, but understandably, given I was recovering from surgery at the time, in a locked drawer at our shared home, and sent that photograph to Cordelia, in a text message, intended to prove I'd been somewhere I'd denied being. That deployment order contained a partial unit designation, still under active classification. Cordelia, in turn, mentioned the document at my mother's dinner table, the same dinner where my mother called Vanessa our family's crown jewel, and called me a broke soldier, in front of my mother, in front of Vanessa, in front of Preston, describing in general terms a document she didn't understand she wasn't supposed to have seen. Someone at that table, later determined to be Preston's business associate, present as a +1, mentioned it further to a colleague, with a security clearance of his own, who recognized what it was and reported an unauthorized disclosure through his own chain. Within 6 hours, a Defense Security Service investigation flagged a compromised classified document trail, leading directly back to my mother's Alexandria home. That is why, at 9:47 p.m., 12 federal agents arrived at that house, not to arrest anyone that night, but to secure the device, identify the disclosure chain, and confirm, in front of my entire family, standing in my mother's foyer under her chandelier, precisely whose classified identity had just been compromised by her own son-in-law's attempt to humiliate me. I will never forget my mother's face in that doorway, the specific way her certainty collapsed in real time as the lead agent asked to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Holt. And my mother, genuinely confused, said, "I'm sorry, there's no Lieutenant Colonel here." And the agent looked past her directly at me, still seated at the dining table with my water glass, and said, "Ma'am, we need a few minutes of your time." Cordelia Chase went white. Vanessa's mouth actually opened and stayed open. My mother turned to look at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face in 34 years. Not anger, not confusion, but the specific vertigo of a person realizing the story she'd been telling herself for over a decade was built on nothing at all. The investigation itself resolved within 72 hours. No charges against me, since I hadn't disclosed anything myself, and a formal referral against Grant for unauthorized handling of a classified document, a referral Elena would later use, with devastating procedural precision, as supplemental evidence of his instability and poor judgment in the ongoing custody and asset dispute, since we did share a rescue dog whose custody had somehow become its own minor battlefield in the larger war. But the emotional damage inside that family did something the federal investigation never could. It planted, 3 days before the hearing, an unshakable seed of doubt in the one person whose certainty had defined my entire life. My mother, finally, for the first time, had to sit with the possibility that she did not actually know her own daughter, and that possibility followed her, visibly, silently, into the courtroom 3 days later. The hearing took place in the Fairfax County Circuit Court, a family and civil matters courtroom with high windows and the particular hush of a room built for consequence rather than spectacle, though this hearing would end up drawing a small, unusual crowd of observers, 2 retired officers from Elena's professional network who'd asked to attend in support. My old friend and fellow deployed medic Staff Sergeant Mia Delgado, who had flown in from Fort Bragg on her own leave time specifically to sit behind me, and, at the defense table, Grant, Marcus Vance, and, in the gallery, my mother, Vanessa, Preston, and Cordelia, all of whom had come, I believe, expecting to watch me lose. Marcus Vance opened exactly as he had in mediation, theatrical and certain, describing to Judge Corrigan Hale a marriage in which, he argued, my client's wife maintained an unusually opaque professional life, one whose actual economic and relational contribution to the marriage remains, frankly, undocumented and unclear. He gestured toward me without looking at me directly, the same performance he'd given for months, and delivered the line that would become the axis this entire story turns on. The sentence Cordelia had echoed, the sentence Vanessa had absorbed secondhand, the sentence my mother had essentially said to my face at her own dinner table. The truth, Your Honor, is that Mrs. Marsh was never really a soldier in any meaningful operational sense. She was, by her own husband's account, essentially performing secretarial and administrative functions for the army. There's no service record here that establishes anything beyond a desk job. Judge Hale, a measured man in his 60s with a habit of removing his glasses before asking a question that mattered, looked toward Elena. Counsel, is there a response to that characterization? Elena Cortez stood, and I want to describe the sound of that courtroom in the exact seconds before she spoke, because I have relived it more times than I've relived almost anything else in my career. The specific creak of the gallery benches as people shifted forward, the dry click of the court reporter's keys pausing, the particular quality of held breath that exists in rooms where something is about to be corrected. Your Honor, the defense's characterization is not only inaccurate, it's precisely the characterization we anticipated, which is why, 3 days ago, this court received a partial declassification order from the Department of Defense, permitting disclosure, under seal, and protective order, of specific unclassified summary language from Lieutenant Colonel Holt's official personnel file. She placed the sealed folder, the same physical object I had carried in my bag for 6 weeks, the pin still in grenade, on the clerk's desk. I'd ask the court's permission to enter this into the sealed record and to read the relevant summary language aloud. Judge Hale reviewed the order, nodded once, and said, "Proceed." Elena read from a single page, her voice steady in a way that filled that entire room. She read my rank, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army, 17 years of active service. She read a single line from my commanding officer's fitness report, language that had been approved for unclassified summary release, specifically because it contained no operational detail, only characterization. Lieutenant Colonel Holt's logistics and casualty coordination leadership was directly and repeatedly credited with survival outcomes across 3 classified rotations in contested theaters, work for which she received the Purple Heart and a Meritorious Service Medal, and which her chain of command has characterized, in writing, as irreplaceable. She read the citation date and location of my Purple Heart Award, the shattered radius and ulna, the convoy, all of it now sitting in an open courtroom record, instead of in the silence I had carried for 9 years of marriage. Then Elena looked directly at Marcus Vance, and at Grant, and said, "Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect that Mr. Marsh sat beside his wife's hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, during her recovery from these documented combat injuries, and, according to his own prior deposition testimony, told hospital staff his wife performed, quote, logistics coordination, without further elaboration, because he did not, and does not, know the true nature of his wife's service. That is not evidence of Lieutenant Colonel Holt's absence from the marriage. That is evidence of a woman who kept a lawful national security silence for 9 years, and a husband who never once asked a second question. I need you to sit with what happened in that gallery in the next several seconds, because it is the entire reason I'm telling you this story. My mother, Diane Holt, made a sound I had genuinely never heard her make. Not a gasp exactly, something closer to the air leaving a person all at once. Vanessa put her hand over her mouth. Cordelia Chase, 3 rows behind the defense table, went rigid, her earlier performance of moral superiority visibly dissolving into something that looked, for the first time in the entire case, like fear of her own son's exposure. And Preston, my brother-in-law, the man whose Wall Street success had been held up against me at every family dinner for 18 months, turned and looked at me with an expression that carried something I did not expect. Not pity, but a kind of quiet, professional respect. The look one operator gives another when a bluff they were watching finally gets called. Judge Hale removed his glasses, the gesture I'd been warned about, the one that meant he was about to say something that mattered. He looked past Elena, past Marcus Vance, directly at me, then at Grant, and said, in a voice that filled the room without needing to be raised, "Mr. Vance, I want to be very clear about something before we proceed. This court has heard, repeatedly, characterizations of Lieutenant Colonel Holt as, in your words, someone performing quote-unquote secretarial functions. Based on the record now before this court, that characterization is not merely wrong. It is precisely, almost word for word, the opposite of what actually happened in this marriage. This woman was never just a secretary. She is Lieutenant Colonel Reagan Holt, and her service, by her own chain of commands account, saved lives in ways your client will apparently never fully understand, and yet found himself remarkably comfortable dismissing. The line landed exactly where I had waited 11 weeks for it to land, inverted, spoken not by me, not even by Elena, but by the one authority in that room, whose word could not be dismissed as bias. Marcus Vance pivoted immediately, arguing that the character of Lieutenant Colonel Holt's service remained separate from the financial matters before the court. Elena was already standing again. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce forensic findings cross-referencing Mr. Marsh's asset transfers with Lieutenant Colonel Holt's subpoenaed deployment orders. What followed was purely mathematical, purely undeniable. Dates, dollar amounts, LLC filings, and deployment orders laid side by side, 72-hour windows repeating 4 separate times, each one a transfer Grant made in the exact days after my orders confirmed I would be unreachable. Judge Hale asked Grant directly, under oath, to explain the pattern. His answer, I don't recall the timing being intentional, collapsed under Elena's follow-up. A single subpoenaed email to his father's associate, read aloud into the permanent record. Better to move this before she's back and asking questions. She'll be gone another 3 weeks at least. I sat perfectly still through all of it, the way I had been trained to sit still through worse. I did not cry, I did not smile. I watched my mother's face instead, and I watched something in her finally break open. Not humiliation on my behalf, not yet, but the dawning, physical realization of exactly how long and how completely she had misjudged her own daughter. In a courtroom, in front of strangers, in front of the daughter she had always favored. The financial ruling came down heavily in my favor. A marital asset division adjusted to account for Grant's concealed transfers. Additional sanctions referred to the court for the concealment itself. And, separately, the earlier Defense Security Service referral regarding his mishandling of the classified document, which Judge Hale noted, dryly, does not reflect favorably on this court's assessment of Mr. Marsh's judgment or credibility. Marcus Vance did not look up from his notes for the remainder of the hearing. What happened outside that courtroom mattered to me more than the ruling itself, because rulings are procedural and families are not. Cordelia Chase, whose entire social identity had rested on unearned moral high ground, found herself, within 2 months, quietly excluded from the same country club committee she'd chaired for 6 years, after word of Grant's document mishandling spread through a circle that valued discretion above almost everything else. She called me once, in November, in a voice stripped of its old performance, and said only, I didn't understand what I was looking at, to which I said nothing at all. Marcus Vance's firm quietly declined to renew his partnership track the following spring, a fact I learned secondhand from Elena, who noted only that reputations in family law travel faster than people think. Grant moved into a rental apartment 40 minutes outside the city, lost the real estate accounts that had depended most heavily on his father's introductions, once word of the federal referral circulated through a professional community, smaller than anyone in it liked to admit, and reached out to me exactly once, 5 months after the hearing, in a letter, not a text, a letter, handwritten, that read in part, I built my whole idea of you around what I was too insecure to ask about. I told people you filed paperwork because it made the space between us smaller than admitting I didn't know my own wife. I did not respond. My mother's reckoning was slower and more honest than any of the others. She did not apologize in the courtroom, or that week, or even that month. It took her 3 months, a Sunday afternoon in February, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table for the first time in years without Vanessa in the room, to say, quietly, staring into a coffee cup she didn't drink from, "I spent 30 years deciding what your life was worth, without ever once asking you to tell me." I told her the truth. The same cold, controlled truth I'd carried through every dinner where she'd diminished me. That I hadn't been able to tell her, not fully, not for most of it, and that the silence had cost me exactly as much as her assumptions had. We are rebuilding something now, my mother and I, not the relationship we had, which was built on a story that was never accurate, but something slower, something that asks questions before it assigns value. Vanessa and I talk more now too. She asked me, for the first time in 29 years, what a casualty forecasting model actually is, and listened for 11 full minutes without checking her phone once, which is, in my family, close to a miracle. I kept the rescue dog. I kept my rank, my clearance, and, once the case fully closed, my sense of who I actually was outside anyone else's story about me. I still can't tell you, even now, exactly what theater I was operating in. During those 11 months, my mother thought I was filing supply requisitions at Fort Sam Houston. I can tell you that the version of me who sat silently through years of being called a broke soldier, with nothing to show for her life, was never the whole truth, only the part I was legally permitted to show. If there's one thing I'd ask you to carry out of this story, it's this. The quietest person at your table might be carrying something you have never once had the humility to ask about. And the cost of never asking is a debt that eventually comes due. In a courtroom, in a driveway, in the silence right before someone finally reads the whole record out loud. What would you have done, sitting at that table, the night before the agents came? I still haven't told you what happened to the sealed unit designation on that photograph Grant sent Cordelia. The one detail from that entire investigation, the Defense Security Service never fully closed. And the reason my phone rang again, 4 months after this story ended,